Well, what is the business response to climate change in Australia? Can we characterise it? Is it highly diverse? What's really going on? And we thought what would be really good and very helpful, I thought, would be to get somebody who's really across the sort of cut and thrust of the daily politics of climate change and business to provide a sort of brief overview of his take on what's going on. And so we've invited Giles Parkinson here from Renew Economy to perform that task. And Giles is probably one of the more well-known journalists reporting in the business and environment space, and I think personally his coverage of the politics of climate change and the business aspects of climate change is some of the best stuff out there. And so what I'd like to do is ask Giles to sort of speak to this very broad issue around really where are we in Australia in terms of business engagement with climate change, what's going on out there, the engagement with the renewables, all of this sort of stuff, fairly open-ended. And then following that, I'll facilitate a discussion between Andy Hoffman and Giles on really a wrap-up of themes around the what, the why and the how of what we've talked about today in terms of business responses to climate change. So I'll hand over to Giles, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Look, I didn't actually have any speech prepared. I thought it was just a panel discussion, so I'm just going to give a few random thoughts and hopefully so they sort of come together in some sort of common theme. And I apologise that I did actually miss most of the sessions, this morning's sessions, which would have been very useful for me, but it was an interesting morning in the renewable energy space, and it's going to be an interesting afternoon in the political space. As, for those who haven't heard, we've got an election, we've got a spill on for the Prime Minister, so business will be watching that with great interest because a lot of the policies that they've defined to deal with climate change and clean energy could well be changed tomorrow and possibly even within 5 weeks. So it's going to be a very interesting time for them all. It was mentioned about the business response to climate change and the sort of the clean energy future, if you like. The truth is there is no business response to it, and in such there's no generic term. It's one of the really frustrating things that you see in the newspapers. Business says they don't like this, business says they don't want that. Well, that's not really true. Some part of the business community say they don't like this or they don't like that, and other parts of the business community say we actually want that because we see the drivers. This has come... Probably if you go back to a decade, and Tony Coleman was here earlier, I think, I'm not too sure if he's still here, there was various groups set up about a decade ago which took a very proactive view of the climate change issues and saw the possibilities and also saw the risks. I was talking to the head of GE the other day, General Electric, and he was describing how 10 years ago, or 2004, they went through, they had a look at the climate change issue, they had a red team and a blue team arguing the case on both sides, and they sort of fell down, this is real, this is going to mean something to our business, and therefore we're going to act. And they did, and they sort of pushed a lot of their investment towards what they called eco-imagination, which sort of sounds like a marketing tool, but they insist it's not, but it has actually increased in revenue, and they would probably feel themselves well positioned for whatever happens in the next sort of 5 or 10 years. But those business responses were probably defined by some sort of abstract or more abstract sort of appreciation of what climate change meant, what it might mean 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future. So some of the people who were thinking of the real long-term implications on their investments, be they fund managers, be they insurers, be they the builders of long-term infrastructure, were the people probably most focused on what was happening. But something's happened quite different in the last couple of years, and that's that even though we feel that we haven't done much on climate change in the international sense, or the climate talks have been failures, or the governments have come together, they've agreed we should be limiting greenhouse emissions to 450 parts per million, we should be aiming for this cap at 2 degrees. They've gone that far, but they haven't actually agreed on what those policies would be and what their individual response will be. But there has been just enough that has been done, particularly in countries such as Germany and China and elsewhere, that has actually changed the nature of the game. They have caused the technologies that John Doerr was talking about and crying about in 2007, one of the previous speakers was talking, will they come through in time? Well, they actually have come through in time. What Germany's done with solar, what other countries have done with other technologies, means that we actually have at our disposal a lot of the tools that we will need to address at least a significant or a large part of the climate change battle. And that has actually redefined the way that businesses look at this issue now. They're probably not talking about it in terms of climate change, but they're actually talking about the economic. It's become an economic reality for a lot of businesses, particularly in the electricity industry, where you have the renewables, wind and solar, which the prevailing wisdom in Australia seems to be that they're intermittent, they're renewable and they're pretty useless, but the actual reality is that they're actually cheaper than coal and gas, and they're actually quite useful, and they're kind of eating the lunch of the incumbents and causing all sorts of problems, which we've seen in Europe. I just lost my thread there, sorry about that. So it's how they react to these economic realities that is going to drive a lot of the action in the next 5 or 10 years. We're starting to see a lot of the big investors and the big analytical firms. I've just got a report this week from Citi, which talks about these issues, and UBS and Deutsche Bank and Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. And so you've got the investors starting to see not just the climate change implications of, what it would mean if you invested too much in coal plants now in Queensland, for instance, or tried to dig up the whole of the Galilee Basin in the hope that China would still want coal in 10 years' time from Australia, but also the implications on the current business models of a lot of the utilities and a lot of other people. And they're also looking at the opportunities for other people with the sort of products that could also help change and make that transition. And that, I guess, is, I'm not too sure how I brought all those threads together, but it is to say that there is really no single business response to this. What has transitioned is from a more of an abstract situation a couple of years ago to a real economic and current and immediate issue, which is why you're seeing a lot of people talking now about the renewable energy target. We've seen Origin Energy this week, we've seen others in the last few weeks. They're really seeing pain, they're seeing real and present threats to their business models. You're seeing other companies who see real opportunities to invest in certain technologies and to make money. And you're seeing a lot of people going through what was described as the Kodak moment of 1970, whatever, when they actually invented the digital technology. They knew what threat it would be, but they sort of thought that well, if they can hide it in the bottom drawer, then maybe it will go away and they can continue. And that didn't happen. We saw it in media as well. They're going through a massive transition at the moment. I was editor of AFR.com 10 years ago. People forgot they actually had a really good website then, was quite progressive, and the editor closed it down in 2003 because he thought it was ruining his business model and his circulation. So if you shut it down, the internet might go away and he can continue printing newspapers happily ever after. But that didn't work out either, so they brought it back 2 or 3 years later. And we're going to just see a lot of those sort of decisions and those sort of moments, I think, in a lot of different businesses, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see the way they respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Giles. I wanted to just, I guess, prompt some questions to both of you about some of the things we've been discussing today. So just reflecting on what you just said then, Giles, it strikes me that's potentially quite a rosy, optimistic sort of picture. We've got these disruptive technologies coming through. There are businesses like GE and there are funds managers looking at this, and it's an economic reality. It's like Andy was talking about last night in terms of sort of a market shift and it's on. I suppose the glass half empty take on that, however, might be that, and it's come up a bit today in discussions around democracy and the political sort of infrastructure around that, that there's this sort of lack of political leadership in Australia and the US and Britain and pretty well everywhere in sort of really coming to grips with this issue and trying to engage with this issue and provide the sort of the signals and the mechanisms through which these more innovative businesses can then sort of take the next leap forward and diffuse this model more generally. So given particularly what's just unfolded today politically in our own federal parliament, what's your thinking on the interface between the politics and the business? Because it seems the two are enmeshed in the current debate around climate change.
Yeah, you're right, and look, I am accused occasionally of having a bit of a looking through rose-coloured glasses at this issue. But the point I want to make is that, say, 10 years ago, we probably didn't think we had the technologies to make this transition as quickly as we thought. It was all too hard, which is probably one of the reasons why we haven't had action from politicians. Now we actually have not all the technologies that we need, but at least some of the technologies we need. So if we actually so we're going to achieve a certain amount of preparation, if you like, for when the politicians actually get it together enough to make the agreement that, well, we can actually be quite ambitious, we can actually achieve this. So from a certain perspective, I think business are probably going to take the lead now. They'll probably drag behind, there you go, I've labelled business altogether. But yeah, in general, they're probably dragged behind by the politicians and a bit of a certain amount of resistance. I think now that some of the economic imperatives are going to drive and lead the politicians, and once the politicians cotton onto that, see how that connects to the politics of the day, then I think you're going to see them prepared to make those steps which are needed. You know, I don't sort of say that we're standing here saying, oh, we're going to solve this problem, we're going to limit it at 450, we are going to achieve 2 degrees Celsius rise, but I certainly think that we're in a better position to do so than we were 5 years ago.
Okay. Andy, on the American political business interface?
I think it's the same situation. I think that the business community is moving ahead. They will drag the politicians along, mostly because the politicians need that kind of cover. No politician is going to come forward with a carbon tax or a cap and trade unless the business community is behind them. U.S. cap, although Waxman-Markey didn't pass, U.S. cap was critical to that conversation. You needed to have the business sector behind them. I think you can back the question up one more, and why is business leading? What is driving them? Is it the investment community? Is it the being poised that there's going to be a technological breakthrough in solar and battery storage, and they need to be on top of it, hybrids? It's a systemic question, but I don't see politicians playing the role they're supposed to be playing in sort of pulling the strings in that system to make it work.
But given today we've sort of talked a lot about, or the theme has come through of business leadership, but a lot of the changes seem quite incremental and quite small scale. And yet the science suggests we really need quantum leaps in sort of uptake of clean technologies, change in the whole energy infrastructure, a price on carbon through some regulatory mechanism. It seems like we have to have that government infrastructure and policy leadership, otherwise business will only go so far within the ambit of their individual firms, and that systemic effect will be sort of lost. So
that is a theme I picked up today. You know, I wrote down, is it Tim Nelson?
Yeah.
Tim Nelson. He said, you know, this is a transition, not a revolution. And I thought that was quite interesting, because others would say, no, we need a revolution. A transition isn't going to get there. You know, replacing your incandescents with CFLs, pat yourself on the back and say problem solved, that's not going to do it. John Ehrenfeld likes to point out that all we're doing right now is focusing on technologies that reduce unsustainability. That's not the same as producing sustainability. But I don't know how you do a revolution in the business sector that will just totally transform things other than some radical technological innovation.
Well, I think it's actually already there. You talked about the incremental gains in solar and some of the other technologies, but they're having a profound impact. UBS did a report last week suggesting that if it continues as it is, then 50 gigawatts of coal and gas will have to be closed in the next 4 years in Germany. That's like 1/2 of their grid. We look at some of the changing dynamics of the Australian market even, which has actually got the most amount of residential solar in the world. It's had an impact. Demand is down more than 10% of where people thought it would be just 2 years ago. The result is, because we've had overbuilding of capacity in the past, the generation which is owned by the Queensland government, coal and mostly coal plants, is actually redundant. They wanted to sell it for $5 billion. I don't know who's going to buy it because it wasn't needed last year. It operated, but they could have actually done without it. These things seem small, but they are having the most profound effect on business models which were created to fit certain technologies and certain designs of markets. And what we're seeing now is a spanner thrown in, and it's and I think that I think AGL is very hopeful that they're going to have a transition. That's the way they would like to manage it, because they've got a lot of sunken capital in big plants. But if you listen to the heads of the two largest German generators and the two biggest utilities in the US, they're talking about revolution. They're using those words. They're saying, we have a solar revolution, this is going to have a dramatic change. No one's really too sure how that plays out, particularly how you get there, because they can sort of see how it will result, and it's going to be a very rocky road to navigate, but it's kind of inevitable, and because you can't really step back, even though some of those companies are trying to force exactly that. And in a sense, now where the politics of the situation is, they're actually asking politicians to stand in the way of progress rather than leading it.
One writer that I was speaking to recently for an interview was Paul Gilding, who's written a quite upbeat piece I saw yesterday about the climate change situation, basically almost declaring victory for environmentalism and the green cause, which really surprised me because his book, The Great Disruption, paints almost a sort of a cataclysmic vision of pretty major social breakup, the real sort of destructive creation, I guess, to spin the Schumpeter and sort of argument of whole industries being denuded, significant mortality, big changes. So the story we're getting here sounds like it could be seen as incremental but potentially radical in the sense of these old industries falling by the wayside relatively quickly. So are you suggesting then that there could be some sudden change then in the nature of industry, we're just not seeing it, and overnight there'll be stranded assets of fossil fuels and what have you? What sort of time frame do you see this panning out over?
Well, no one really knows, but in this report about Germany, where we've actually sort of this, I mean, it's an advanced economy. It's got it's the strongest manufacturing economy in the world. The reports, UBS have done a report, Deutsche Bank have done a report, HSBC have done a report, and they're all talking about that these assets could be stranded within years. E.ON, the biggest utility in the country, built a gas-fired plant, spent almost $1 billion on it. Only opened it 3 years ago. They're talking about closing it already because what they perceived to be the model for the energy industry 3 years ago is now dramatically changed. It just doesn't fit in there anymore. That's how quickly that transition is happening. How that plays out is probably impossible to tell, but I wouldn't underestimate its force.
And a price on carbon, is that essential? We have to have that?
Look, I think so. Look, I don't think it's actually essential at the moment in Australia, in the sense that I think it's important. It's important to have a price on carbon, a price. I don't think it's important what that price is at the moment. A price on carbon is important because it sends a signal and a message to all company boards and to all people that you have to value, you have to sort of count this particular commodity or this particular item, and that's absolutely essential because they've never done it before, and that's critical. And that is the mechanism that you are going to use when the politicians come to the day saying, okay, we're not going to have a 5% emissions reduction target, we're going to have a 20 or 25% emissions reduction target, we've got to go for it. And solar and wind are not going to deliver all of that, they're going to sort of take us some way down the path, but we're going to need more of an effort. But that's your mechanism to do that. You're not going to, a green, I don't want to get too political, but I mean, having a green army going around sort of picking up rubbish and building boardwalks is not going to do it. So, that mechanism's essential.
I'm not used to being not the most optimistic person on the stage. I'm usually that guy, so this is interesting. I'll try and optimistic you. We can try and imagine what those technological shifts would be. Tim said that he thought that distributed energy would make the grid obsolete. That's mind-blowing, and that would be a revolution. Or if we developed battery storage that had the same unit of energy per unit of volume as a tank of gasoline, the automotive sector, and provided that battery can be charged up in the same period of time. Those kinds of technological shifts can come along. They're extremely unpredictable. Look in the United States right now. The EIA just came out with their forecast 2030. And every president in the United States has been promising since probably Eisenhower, if not before, that the United States will be energy independent. Well, it's about to happen. And the EIA said that the U.S. will be an energy exporter in the next 10 years because of fracking, because of natural gas. Who would have predicted that? With the technology coming along to break the shale gas free, that fundamentally changes the game. But it also, it messes things up. It's going to close coal-fired power plants, but it also, because the gas is so cheap, is diverting a bit of energy from the renewable energy sector. So, if you try and picture what energy is going to look like in Australia or the United States 30 or 50 years from now, good luck. It's going to be fundamentally different, and it's very hard to predict.
So we've got massive technological innovation, these market shifts happening, and a positive sort of view on that is that this change will roll out through the sort of market imperatives and what have you. And yet, in your talk last night, Andy, you really stressed the values divide politically in the US, and I think it's probably pretty close in Australia as well. And given the current political scenario we're looking at today, we're going to have possibly a future federal government which is going to take away a lot of those clean energy mechanisms and what have you. So I guess the human dimension, to the flip side of the technology and economics, how do we overcome the divide on the human dimension on this? And is that possible? Is the hysteria around climate change denial, for want of a better word, the last gasp of those that sort of trying to lobby and prevent change, or is there something more fundamental that is going to play out over 10, 20 years of partisan sort of political combat?
I think about this question by thinking about whether the climate change issue is a social movement or is it something bigger? Is it a fundamental transition in our society? Is it something akin to the Enlightenment? I mean, the Enlightenment was a shift in how we view the world and our place within it. It was moving beyond superstition and the dominance of the church to look at rational, scientific evidence. It was the beginning of that fundamental shift in how we see the world. Is climate change that? Is it really changing our view? It's entering the Anthropocene? Is that akin to the Enlightenment? Is it that big? Or is it a social movement like Bill McKibben's trying to do, of mobilizing people around 350.org? The social movement metaphor, it troubles me a little bit. In a social movement, you have a clear constituency. You have women's rights, minority rights, gay rights. We know the constituency that's pushing for those. They get a benefit from what comes out. They have a clear goal. I'm gay, I want to get married. I'm a woman, I want equal pay for equal work. I'm a minority and I want affirmative action and access to higher education. What do we want on climate change? Picture a protest outside the White House, people with signs saying, what do you want? We want X. When do you want it? We want it now. What is X? I want a carbon-free economy. I want it now. I don't think so. I want the end of the fossil fuel sector, and I want it now. That doesn't work either. So the social movement metaphor, I have trouble with. I don't know if that changes the tactics we use, but I think it's bigger. I think it's more like the Enlightenment than a standard social movement.
Giles, on that one?
Take that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try and compete on that one, no. Yeah, look, the politics of climate change just continue to perplex me. I don't really understand it. I've never worked in Canberra or Washington or anywhere like that, and I don't really get it. The only explanation, there's clearly ideology is involved here. I don't really understand, never having sort of studied that how that works and how you can be that determined, but obviously people can be very fixed in their ways and fixed in their views. But a lot of it is quite clearly driven by the vested interests, and we shouldn't underestimate how powerful they are and how much of an influence they have. And I was talking to someone this morning who just said, look, you just got to understand that these people are very powerful and they have a lot to lose. And the International Energy Agency has quantified how much they've got to lose if you put in those policies which they are urging to be implemented. And they've quantified that, and it's it's $1 trillion a year, and there's a lot of people who don't want to lose that much money, and they've actually almost tried to engender their own social movement in support of it. So I don't quite understand how the dynamics of that works, but that's why you'd hope that the economics of what's happening can redefine some of the politics.
Yeah, well, just on that, it occurred to me as you were speaking, the social movement, think of Bill McKibben and 350.org and the fact that they did have a protest outside the White House and James Hansen and the others were chained at the railing around the Keystone Pipeline.
And that gives them, what do you want?
Yeah.
It gave them a target. I actually think it's a misguided target because most people don't make a connection between Keystone and climate change, and they just see obstructionist environmentalists, pains in the asses, misdirected. So again, I still stand by the challenge of creating a social movement around this.
But on the flip side of that, I guess if we're looking at the social movement that has probably had a more profound effect, it is the climate change denial industry perhaps. And maybe it's an easier ask in a sense because they're not asking for a radical change in an economic system, they're just trying to maintain business as usual. and they have significant funding from major fossil fuel companies, Coke Industries, etc. But if you look at the way in which they've quite skillfully, I think, created this, I wouldn't call it a faux social movement, but certainly this sort of argument against climate change, against science, link it to fundamentalist religion, link it to a sort of individual rights. They've been very skillful at doing that. And so one of the themes I think today has been quite interesting is this whole micro issue. Well, how do we diffuse change within organisations, the role of emotions in that? How do we diffuse change across societies? And maybe we should be not just looking at sort of the advocates for climate change, but analysing how the climate change denial side of things have been so skillful in sort of setting up the political framework and the terms of debate, much like you were discussing last night, Andy, in terms of going to the Heartland Institute and seeing the sort of the discursive constructions there.
I want to echo something you said, Giles. I mean, the environmental movement is indeterminate. Who's an environmentalist? It could be anybody. It could be minority, male, female, poor, rich. It doesn't have a clear constituency. Those who are threatened, whose material interests are threatened by the agenda of the environmental movement, is a clear constituency. And as we teach in negotiations, the worst thing you can do is create a situation where the person you're negotiating with has nothing to lose. They'll throw out all the stops to beat you. And climate change, especially Bill McKibben's agenda, and I admire Bill for creating a social movement, but he set it up. We want the end of the fossil fuel industry. You have now set up a situation where they will throw out all the stops to beat you, because what else do they have? Put me out of business, I'll use all my assets to stop you because I have nothing else to lose.
Mm.
Yeah, Bill McKibben's really interesting. I mean, his position is slightly different from a lot of the others in the sense that he's convinced that we've already gone past the point of no return. He actually wants to sort of roll it back, which is why he's being so dogmatic about sort of closing, about Keystone and what have you. He said, so we've already gone too far. We shouldn't be stopping at 350. We should have shouldn't be stopping at 450. We should have stopped at 350. So that's where he's coming from. As far as the politics and how do you combat? We've been trying to figure out since 2001 how you, and many decades beforehand, actually how you combat the politics of fear, through which a lot of this topic is expressed. And I'm not too sure anyone's really come up with an answer for that. You'd like to think the politics of hope, but you need a special kind of person to deliver that, and I haven't seen them around so far.
Can I offer something that I think fits with the optimistic theme you're pushing here? May I propose that we're perhaps in the midst of an energy renaissance, that things are changing around us very quickly, very hard to read. The funny thing about a renaissance is you never know you're in it until it's done. And all you know in the moment is the pain of what you're losing, and that's why we have Ron Paul and his Freedom of Lighting Act saying, "How dare you take my incandescent light bulbs?" People just lament what they're losing. People don't like change, but I think an upshot of what you're saying is change is happening around us, and what the outcome will be is anyone's guess, but it will be fundamentally different than what we have right now.
Okay.
And just one little thing, and because change is happening, I don't think it's actually going to be that hard for some of those politicians, when they're ready for it, to actually flip their policies upside down and express that in a way which is actually sort of suitable. So, I think we could see that with our next government, as strange as it may seem. Yeah. Geez, I am really optimistic today. I'm not too sure what I had for lunch.
Your happy calls.
I might just withdraw that last remark. So I'm just going to give a few random thoughts, and hopefully so they sort of come together in some sort of common theme. And I apologise that I did actually miss most of the sessions, this morning's sessions, which would have been very useful for me. But it was an interesting morning in the renewable energy space, and it's going to be an interesting afternoon in the political space. As, for those who haven't heard, we've got an election, we've got a spill on for the Prime Minister. So business will be watching that with great interest, because a lot of the policies that they've defined to deal with climate change and clean energy could well be changed tomorrow, and possibly even within 5 weeks. So it's going to be a very interesting time for them all. It was mentioned about the business response to climate change and
coverage of the politics of climate change and the business aspects of climate change is some of the best stuff out there. And so what I'd like to do is ask Giles to sort of speak to this very broad issue around really where are we in Australia in terms of business engagement with climate change, what's going on out there, the engagement with the renewables, all of this sort of stuff, fairly open-ended. And then following that, I'll facilitate a discussion between Andy Hoffman and Giles on really a wrap-up of themes around the what, the why and the how of what we've talked about today in terms of business responses to climate change. So I'll hand over to Giles, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Look, I didn't actually have any speech prepared. I thought it was just a panel discussion. 2004, they went through, they had a look at the climate change issue, they had a red team and a blue team arguing the case on both sides, and they sort of fell down, this is real, this is going to mean something to our business, and therefore we're going to act. And they did, and they sort of pushed a lot of their investment towards what they called eco-imagination, which sort of sounds like a marketing tool, but they insist it's not, but it has actually increased in revenue, and they would probably feel themselves well positioned for whatever happens in the next sort of 5 or 10 years. But those business responses were probably defined by some sort of abstract or more abstract sort of appreciation of what climate change meant, what it might mean 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future. So some of the people who were thinking of the real long-term implications on their investments, be they fund managers, be they insurers, be
Well, what is the business response to climate change in Australia? Can we characterise it? Is it highly diverse? What's really going on? And we thought what would be really good and very helpful, I thought, would be to get somebody who's really across the sort of cut and thrust of the daily politics of climate change and business to provide a sort of brief overview of his take on what's going on. And so we've invited Giles Parkinson here from Renew Economy to perform that task. And Giles is probably one of the more well-known journalists reporting in the business and environment space, and I think personally
and the sort of the clean energy future, if you like. The truth is there is no business response to it, and in such there's no generic term. It's one of the really frustrating things that you see in the newspapers. Business says they don't like this, business says they don't want that. Well, that's not really true. Some part of the business community say they don't like this or they don't like that, and other parts of the business community say we actually want that because we see the drivers. This has come, probably if you go back to a decade, and Tony Coleman was here earlier, I think, I'm not too sure if he's still here. There was various groups set up about a decade ago which took a very proactive view of the climate change issues and saw the possibilities and also saw the risks. I was talking to the head of GE the other day, General Electric, and he was describing how 10 years ago or